Welcome to Memoirs of Darkness. What you are about to hear is not a celebrated story. It is not a tale preserved in museums or spoken of in grand narratives of tragedy and heroism. It is something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that existed in the margins of history, in the silence between recorded events, in the absence of documentation. In the spring of 1912, the world was captivated by the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. Newspapers across Europe and America printed illustrations of the ship's grandeur. The vessel was called Unsinkable, a floating monument to human ambition and industrial triumph. But there are always stories that do not make it into the newspapers. There are always faces that do not appear in the photographs. There are always voices that are not recorded, not because they did not speak, but because no one was listening. This is the story of one such voice, a man named Samuel, a man who boarded the Titanic in April of 1912 and whose existence aboard that ship was erased from nearly every official record. For 83 years, his story remained buried, not beneath the ocean, but beneath something far more deliberate, beneath silence, beneath indifference, beneath the collective decision of a society that did not wish to remember him. Samuel was born in 1887 in the Caribbean, on an island where the air smelled of salt and sugar cane, where the hills were green and the nights were filled with the sound of drums and distant prayers. His family was not wealthy, but they were not destitute. His father had been a clerk, his mother a seamstress. They believed in education. They believed in discipline. They believed that their son could become something more than the island would allow. And so, in 1902, at the age of 15, Samuel was sent across the Atlantic to study in Europe. He carried with him a single leather suitcase, a letter from his father, and the weight of every hope his family had ever held. He arrived in France. He enrolled in a technical school. He learned to speak French with barely a trace of accent. He studied engineering, mathematics, mechanical design. He excelled. His instructors noted his intelligence, his precision, his quiet determination. But when Samuel graduated and began searching for work, he discovered something that no amount of education could overcome. The world did not want a black engineer. The world wanted black laborers, black servants, black shadows in the background of white achievement. But a black man with a degree, with ambition, with the audacity to expect equality? That was unacceptable. Samuel applied to dozens of firms. He was refused by all of them. He took menial jobs, he waited tables, he cleaned floors, he repaired machinery in factories where white men, half as educated as him, were given positions of authority. And he endured it, because he had no choice. But in 1908, something changed. Samuel met a woman named Marie. She was French, she was the daughter of a shopkeeper, and she did not care about the color of his skin. Marie was 20 years old when she met Samuel. She worked in her father's bookshop in a quiet district of Paris, a place that smelled of old paper and tobacco smoke. Samuel had wandered in one afternoon looking for a technical manual. She had helped him find it. They spoke for nearly an hour. He returned the next day, and the day after that, and soon it was not about the books anymore. It was about the way she looked at him. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if she saw him as a man, not a symbol, not a problem, not a curiosity, just a man. They began meeting in cafes. They walked together along the Seine. They talked about everything: politics, art, the future, the absurdity of the world they lived in. Marie's father disapproved. He did not shout, he did not forbid, he simply grew colder. He stopped speaking to his daughter at dinner.
He stopped acknowledging Samuel's existence. But Marie was stubborn. She had inherited that from him. In the winter of 1909, Samuel and Marie were married in a small ceremony attended by only a handful of people. Her father did not come. Her mother came, but said nothing. Samuel's family, thousands of miles away across the ocean, did not even know until months later. The marriage was real, but it was also an act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against a world that insisted such unions should not exist. For the first 2 years, they lived in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Paris. Samuel continued to work whatever jobs he could find. Marie took in sewing to help pay the rent. They were poor, but they were together, and for a time, that was enough. But then Marie became pregnant. And then she became pregnant again, and the cramped apartment became even smaller, and the money became even tighter, and Samuel began to feel the walls closing in.
By the spring of 1912, Samuel and Marie had 2 children, a daughter named Claire, who was 3 years old, and a son named Henri, who was barely 1. Henri had been born sickly. He cried through the night. He had trouble breathing. The doctors said he needed better air, better food, better care. But Samuel could not afford better anything. He was working 12-hour days in a factory, assembling parts for machines he would never own, under the supervision of men who spoke to him as if he were a child. He came home exhausted, his hands stained with grease, his back aching, his mind numb. And Marie, who had once been so full of life, so full of laughter, was now pale and tired and silent. She spent her days caring for the children, mending clothes, boiling potatoes, trying to make their small rations stretch further than they could. She never complained, but Samuel could see the exhaustion in her eyes. He could see the way her hands shook when she thought he was not looking. He could see the way she held Henri against her chest at night, rocking him gently, whispering prayers that Samuel did not believe in. And he realized that something had to change. He could not continue like this. His family could not continue like this. He had to find a way out. And so he made a decision. He would take his family to the Caribbean, back to the island where he had been born, back to the place where his skin would not be a barrier, where his education would mean something, where his children could grow up without the weight of European disdain pressing down on their shoulders. Samuel wrote to his family. He explained the situation. He asked for help. And his mother, who had not seen him in 10 years, who had aged in his absence, who had never stopped hoping he would return, sent money. Enough for tickets, enough for passage across the Atlantic. Samuel went to the shipping office in Paris. He inquired about routes. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetual frown, informed him that the most direct route would take them through Southampton, England, and then across to New York, and from there they could catch another ship south. Samuel asked about ships. The clerk mentioned several, but one name stood out: the Titanic. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a declaration. It was the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands. It weighed over 46,000 tons. It had been built in Belfast over the course of 3 years by thousands of workers, many of whom had died in the process, crushed by machinery, drowned in the docks, their deaths quietly recorded and quickly forgotten. The ship was designed to carry over 2,000 passengers and crew. It had a gymnasium, a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a grand staircase made of oak and wrought iron, dining rooms that could seat hundreds, and cabins that ranged from opulent suites with private promenades to cramped third-class berths with barely enough room to turn around. The ship was divided not just by decks, but by class. First-class passengers paid hundreds of pounds for their tickets. They were served 7-course meals. They were attended by stewards who knew their names. They walked on decks that were scrubbed clean every morning. Second-class passengers paid less but still traveled in relative comfort. They had access to libraries, smoking rooms, and dining halls that were modest but respectable. Third-class passengers, the majority of those aboard, paid the least. They slept in dormitories. They ate simple meals at long communal tables. They were kept separate from the upper decks by locked gates and strict regulations. The ship was a microcosm of the world. It reflected every hierarchy, every division, every unspoken rule about who mattered and who did not. And Samuel, when he purchased his tickets, purchased second class. Not because he could afford first class. He could not. But because second class allowed him something that third class did not. Dignity. Or at least the appearance of it. The tickets cost nearly everything his mother had sent, but Samuel did not hesitate. This was their escape. This was their future. He brought the tickets home and showed them to Marie. She held them in her hands as if they were fragile, as if they might dissolve. She asked him if he was sure. He told her he was. On the morning of April 10, 1912, Samuel and Marie and their 2 children left Paris by train. The journey to Cherbourg, the French port where they would board the Titanic, took several hours. The train was crowded. Other passengers stared at them. A black man, a white woman, 2 children who did not quite look like either. Some stared with curiosity, some with disdain, some with something that resembled pity. Samuel ignored them all. He had learned to do that years ago. He held Henri in his lap. The boy was feverish, his small body trembling. Marie held Claire, who was unusually quiet, sensing perhaps that something important was happening, something that required silence. When they arrived in Cherbourg, the port was already crowded with passengers waiting to board the Titanic. The ship itself was too large to dock at the pier, so smaller boats, called tenders, were used to ferry passengers out to where the great vessel waited in deeper water. Samuel and his family boarded one of these tenders. It was called the Nomadic. It was painted white, and it rocked gently in the water as passengers climbed aboard. The tender pulled away from the dock and moved slowly toward the Titanic. And then Samuel saw it. The ship rose out of the water like a black cliff. Its hull was impossibly tall, impossibly smooth, impossibly solid. 4 funnels towered above the decks, painted in the colors of the White Star Line, yellow and black, releasing thin trails of smoke into the gray sky. The ship did not look real. It looked like something out of a dream or a nightmare, something too large to exist, too powerful to fail. Samuel felt a strange sensation in his chest. Not excitement, not fear. Something else, a kind of dread, as if he were looking at something that should not be. The tender pulled alongside the Titanic, and passengers began climbing a gangway up to the second-class entrance. Samuel helped Marie, who was struggling with Claire. He carried Henri, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. They stepped onto the ship at exactly 6:30 in the evening. The sun was beginning to set. The air was cold, and Samuel, for reasons he could not explain, felt as if he had just crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Their cabin was located on E deck, deep within the hull of the ship. It was small but clean. 2 narrow beds bolted to the floor, a wash basin, a porthole that looked out onto the black water. The walls were painted white. The floor was covered in linoleum. It smelled faintly of paint and disinfectant. Marie sat down on one of the beds and exhaled. She looked exhausted. Claire climbed onto the other bed and immediately began exploring, touching the walls, peering out the porthole, chattering in the high, breathless way that children do. Henri remained in Samuel's arms, limp and warm. That first night, The family ate dinner in the second-class dining saloon. It was a large room with long tables and white tablecloths. The walls were paneled in oak. The lighting was soft, almost dim. The room was filled with passengers, families, couples, lone travelers. Some were speaking in French, others in English. A few in languages Samuel did not recognize. The food was simple but plentiful. Soup, bread, roasted meat, potatoes, pudding. Claire ate eagerly. Henri refused to eat. Marie tried to coax him, but he turned his head away and whimpered. Samuel watched his son and felt a knot tighten in his chest. Other passengers in the dining room noticed them. Samuel could feel their eyes. A black man with a white wife and 2 mixed children. It was not a common sight. Some passengers whispered to each other. Some simply stared. A few smiled politely, but the smiles did not reach their eyes. Samuel kept his head down. He focused on his food. He told himself that in a few days they would be in New York, and then in a few more days they would be on another ship heading south. And then they would be home, and none of this would matter. But the stares did not stop. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. The Titanic sailed through calm seas for the first 3 days. The weather was clear. The water was smooth. Passengers settled into routines. They walked the decks. They played cards. They read books in the second-class library. They attended church services led by the ship's captain. Samuel spent most of his time in the cabin with Henri. The boy's condition had not improved. He was feverish and lethargic. He barely ate. Marie was growing more and more worried. She asked Samuel if they should speak to the ship's doctor. Samuel was reluctant. He did not trust doctors. He had seen too many times how black patients were treated differently, how their pain was dismissed, how their concerns were ignored. But Marie insisted, and so, on the 3rd day, Samuel took Henri to the ship's medical office. The doctor was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a distracted manner. He examined Henri briefly. He listened to his chest with a stethoscope. He asked a few questions, and then he told Samuel that the boy probably had a minor respiratory infection, that it was common in children, that it would pass. He gave Samuel a small bottle of tonic and told him to give the boy a spoonful 3 times a day. Samuel thanked him, but as he left the office, he felt a deep unease. The doctor had barely looked at Henri. He had barely looked at Samuel. The examination had lasted less than 5 minutes. Samuel returned to the cabin and gave Henri the tonic. The boy coughed and spit it out. Marie tried again, the same result. By the 4th day, April 14th, Henri was worse. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His skin was hot to the touch. He cried weakly, a thin sound that barely carried across the small cabin. Marie was frantic. She wanted to take him back to the doctor, but Samuel refused. He had lost faith in the doctor. He told Marie they would wait until they reached New York. It was only 1 more day. They could manage 1 more day. He believed this. He had to believe it. That evening, April 14th, the ship's atmosphere was unusually festive. It was the last night before arrival in New York. Many passengers dressed in their finest clothes. The dining rooms were full. The lounges were crowded. Music drifted through the corridors. Samuel did not participate in any of it. He stayed in the cabin with Henri. Marie had taken Claire to the dining room for supper, but Samuel had remained behind. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding his son, rocking him gently, whispering words in Creole that his own mother had once whispered to him. The boy's eyes were half closed. His breathing was labored. Samuel felt helpless. He had crossed an ocean to give his children a better life, and now one of them was dying in his arms. and there was nothing he could do. He thought about his mother. He thought about the island. He thought about the mistakes he had made, the years he had wasted in France, the opportunities he had let slip through his fingers because the world had decided his skin made him less than human. And he felt a rage building inside him. Not loud, not explosive, but deep and cold and corrosive. A rage that had been growing for years, fed by every insult, every rejection, every closed door, every false smile. He was so lost in thought that he almost did not notice when the ship shuddered. It was a subtle movement, a faint vibration that traveled through the floor and up through the frame of the bed. Samuel looked up. He waited. The ship's engines, which had been humming steadily since they left Cherbourg, suddenly went silent. The room became very quiet. Too quiet. Samuel stood, still holding Henri. He walked to the porthole and looked out. He could see nothing but darkness. No lights, no land. Just the black water and the black sky merging into one endless void. And then he heard voices, shouting, running footsteps in the corridor outside. Samuel opened the cabin door and stepped into the corridor. Other passengers were emerging from their rooms, confused, asking questions. A steward was walking quickly past, his face pale. Samuel called out to him. He asked what had happened. The steward paused. He said the ship had struck ice. He said it was nothing to worry about. He said passengers should put on their life jackets as a precaution and proceed to the boat deck. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Samuel went back into the cabin. He placed Henri on the bed. He found the life jackets stored in a compartment near the door. There were 4 of them, made of cork and canvas, bulky and awkward. He helped Henri into one, tying the straps as tightly as he dared. The boy did not resist. He simply lay there, limp and feverish. Samuel put on his own life jacket, and then he waited. Marie and Claire had not yet returned from the dining room. Samuel told himself they would be back any moment. He told himself there was no reason to panic. The steward had said it was a precaution. The ship was unsinkable, everyone said so. But minutes passed, and Marie did not return. The voices in the corridor grew louder. More passengers were moving toward the stairs. Samuel could hear the sound of doors slamming, of children crying, of someone shouting orders in English. He could no longer wait. He picked up Henri, still wrapped in the life jacket, and stepped back into the corridor. He had to find Marie and Claire. The corridor was crowded now. Passengers were pushing toward the stairs, their faces tight with fear. Samuel joined the flow, moving slowly, carefully, trying not to jostle Henri. The ship was tilting. Not much, just a few degrees, but enough that Samuel could feel it in the way his weight shifted, the way the floor seemed to slope gently downward toward the bow. He reached the stairs and climbed, up one deck, then another. The air grew colder. He could hear the wind now, howling through open doors, and then he was on the boat deck. The boat deck was chaos. Hundreds of passengers crowded around the lifeboats. Officers in uniform were shouting orders. Crew members were struggling with ropes and davits. Some lifeboats were already being lowered, swinging out over the side of the ship, descending toward the black water far below. Women were crying. Children were screaming. Men were shouting questions that no one answered. The night was bitterly cold. The stars were impossibly bright. The ocean was perfectly calm, a vast sheet of black glass stretching to the horizon. And scattered across the deck were chunks of ice. Small pieces, glittering in the light from the ship's windows. Samuel pushed through the crowd, searching for Marie. He called her name. No one responded. The noise was overwhelming, and then he saw her. She was standing near one of the lifeboats, clutching Claire against her chest. Her face was white with terror. Her eyes were wide and searching. Samuel ran toward her. He called out. She turned and saw him. Relief flooded her face. She reached for him. But before they could touch, a hand grabbed Samuel's arm. It was a crew member, a young man with a hard face. He told Samuel to step back. He told him the lifeboat was only for women and children. Samuel tried to explain. He pointed at Marie. He pointed at Henri in his arms. He said they were together. They were a family. The crew member looked at Samuel, then at Marie, then at the children. His expression changed. Something flickered in his eyes. Not sympathy. Something else. Suspicion. He asked if the children were really Samuel's. Samuel did not understand the question at first, and then he did. The crew member saw a black man and a white woman and two children who did not look entirely black or entirely white, and he doubted. He doubted that they were a family. He doubted that Samuel had any right to be near them. Samuel felt the rage return, but he pushed it down. He could not afford anger now. He could not afford to argue. He needed to get his family onto a lifeboat. That was all that mattered. He told the crew member, slowly and clearly, that yes, these were his children, that the woman was his wife, that they needed to board the lifeboat together. The crew member hesitated. He looked uncertain. Another officer approached, older, with a thick mustache and a stern expression. He asked what the problem was. The first crew member explained. The older officer looked at Samuel for a long moment, and then he made a decision. He told Samuel that Marie and the children could board, but Samuel could not. The rule was women and children first. Samuel tried to argue. He said Henri was sick. He said the boy needed his father. But the officer was unmoved. He repeated the rule: women and children. Samuel looked at Marie. She was crying now, silently, tears streaming down her face. She shook her head. She did not want to leave him. But they both knew there was no choice. The lifeboat was being loaded. Other women and children were climbing in. If Marie did not go now, she might not get another chance. Samuel stepped closer. He handed Henri to Marie. The boy was barely conscious, his head lolling against her shoulder. Samuel kissed his son's forehead. He whispered something in Creole. And then he turned to Claire. He knelt down so he was eye level with her. She looked at him with confusion. She asked where Papa was going. Samuel told her he would see her soon. He told her to be brave. He told her to take care of Mama. Claire nodded, though she did not understand. Samuel kissed her. And then he stood and looked at Marie one last time. He wanted to memorize her face, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the way her hair fell across her forehead. He wanted to hold on to this moment, because some part of him, some deep animal part, knew that this was the last time he would ever see her. Marie and the children were helped into the lifeboat. Claire climbed in first, stumbling slightly. Marie followed, clutching Henri against her chest. She sat down on one of the wooden benches. The lifeboat was already crowded. Women pressed together, some still in their evening gowns, some wrapped in coats and blankets. A few children sat silently, wide-eyed and pale. The crew began lowering the boat. The ropes creaked, the pulleys groaned. The lifeboat descended jerkily, swaying in the cold air. Marie looked up at the ship's deck, searching for Samuel. She found him. He was standing at the railing, watching her. Even from that distance, even in the dim light, she could see his face. And she saw something in his expression that broke her. Not fear, not despair, but acceptance. He knew. He had already accepted what was going to happen. The lifeboat hit the water with a splash. Crew members released the ropes. Other crew members began rowing, pulling away from the ship. Marie kept her eyes on Samuel. She watched as the distance grew. 10 feet, 20, 50. The ship's lights were blazing. The deck was still crowded with people. The orchestra was playing. She could hear the faint strains of a waltz drifting across the water. It was surreal. It was impossible. The Titanic was sinking, and someone had decided that the appropriate response was to play music. Samuel remained at the railing until Marie could no longer see his face clearly, until he became just a shape, just a silhouette. And then the lifeboat turned, and the ship was behind them, and all Marie could see was the glow of its lights against the darkness. She held Henri close. She held Claire close. And she did not look back again. Samuel stood at the railing for a long time after the lifeboat disappeared into the night. Around him, the chaos continued. More lifeboats were being lowered. Passengers were shouting, crying, praying. Officers were firing pistols into the air to maintain order. The ship was tilting more noticeably now. Samuel could feel it in his legs, the way he had to brace himself to stand upright. The bow was sinking. The stern was rising, and there were no more lifeboats. Samuel walked away from the railing. He moved slowly through the crowd. No one paid attention to him. He was invisible now. Just another man among hundreds, all of them realizing, slowly or suddenly, that they were going to die. He found a quiet spot near the second-class entrance. He sat down on a bench. The wood was cold. The metal railing beside him was covered in frost. He looked up at the sky. The stars were beautiful, cold and distant and indifferent. He thought about his mother. He thought about the letters he had written to her over the years, letters describing his life in France, his studies, his marriage, his struggles. He thought about the letter she would receive in a few weeks, the one that would tell her he was dead. He thought about Henri. The boy had been dying before the ship even struck the iceberg. Samuel had known it, though he had refused to admit it. He had told himself that once they reached the island, once Henri could breathe clean air and eat good food, he would recover. But that was a lie he had told himself because the truth was too unbearable. And now Henri was in a lifeboat, in his mother's arms, and Samuel would never know if he survived. He would die not knowing. That thought was worse than the cold, worse than the fear, worse than the knowledge that the ship beneath him was about to break apart and drag him down into the black water. The ship's lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then they went out completely. The sudden darkness was absolute. Passengers screamed. Some began praying aloud. Others simply wept. Samuel sat in the darkness and waited. His eyes adjusted slowly. The starlight was just enough to see shapes, outlines, the silhouettes of people moving against the sky. The ship groaned. It was a deep, metallic sound, like the earth splitting open. The stern began to rise higher. The deck tilted sharply. Samuel gripped the bench to keep from sliding forward. Passengers lost their footing. Some tumbled down the deck, colliding with railings, with each other, with the unyielding steel of the ship's structure. Samuel could hear bones breaking. He could hear people screaming as they fell. And then the ship's hull split. The sound was indescribable, a roar like thunder, like 1,000 cannons firing at once. The Titanic broke in two. The bow, already submerged, tore away from the stern and plunged into the depths. The stern remained floating for a moment, vertical, pointing toward the sky like a monument. And then it, too, began to sink. Samuel did not scream. He did not pray. He simply stood and walked toward the railing. The water was rising to meet him. He could see it, black and cold, rushing up the deck. He thought about Marie one last time. He pictured her face. He pictured Claire's small hand in his. He pictured Henri's weak breath against his neck. And then the water reached him. It was so cold that it felt like fire. It stole the breath from his lungs. It wrapped around his body like iron. He tried to swim. His arms moved, his legs kicked. But the weight of his clothes, the weight of the life jacket, the weight of everything, dragged him down. The last thing Samuel saw was the stars, bright and cold and impossibly far away. And then the water closed over his head, and there was nothing. Marie sat in the lifeboat and listened to the screams. They had been rowing for 20 minutes when the Titanic's lights went out. The ship had become a dark shape against the stars, its stern rising higher and higher until it was almost vertical. And then it was gone. The screams lasted for a long time. Hundreds of voices crying out in the freezing water, begging for help that would not come. The lifeboat's crew did not turn back. They rowed further away. Some of the women in the boat begged them to go back. They said there was room. They said they could save a few more people. But the crew refused. They said the survivors in the water would swamp the boat. They said everyone would die. And so they rowed away from the screams, and the women sat in silence, and the screams grew fainter and fainter, until finally they stopped. Marie did not cry. She sat in the lifeboat with Henri in her arms and Claire pressed against her side, and she stared at the place where the ship had been, and she felt nothing. Not grief, not fear, just emptiness. A void where something vital had been ripped away. Henri was cold. His breathing was shallow. Marie tried to warm him with her body, but she had no warmth to give. Claire was shivering violently, her teeth chattering. The night stretched on. Hours passed. The ocean was silent. The stars slowly wheeled overhead, and then, just before dawn, they saw lights on the horizon. A ship. The RMS Carpathia had received the Titanic's distress signal and had raced through the night to reach them. The lifeboats rowed toward it. One by one, they were brought alongside the rescue ship. Rope ladders were lowered. Survivors climbed aboard. Some had to be carried. Marie climbed the ladder with Claire clinging to her back. She held Henri against her chest with one arm. Her legs shook, her hands were numb, but she climbed. When she reached the deck of the Carpathia, someone wrapped a blanket around her. Someone else took Henri from her arms to examine him. Marie tried to protest, but she had no strength left. She collapsed onto the deck and closed her eyes. Henri died 2 days later. He never regained consciousness. His small body, already weakened by illness, could not survive the cold and the trauma. The ship's doctor did what he could, but it was not enough. Marie was with him when he died. She held his hand. She whispered to him in French. She told him she was sorry. She told him his father had loved him. And then he was gone. They buried him at sea. It was a brief ceremony, a few words spoken by the captain, a prayer, and then his small body, wrapped in canvas, was slipped over the side of the ship and disappeared into the water. Marie did not cry. She stood at the railing and watched the place where he had vanished, and she felt the emptiness inside her grow larger. When the Carpathia arrived in New York, the pier was crowded with thousands of people, reporters, family members, curious onlookers. Marie disembarked with Claire, holding her daughter's hand tightly. They had nothing,
No luggage, no money, no plan. A representative from a relief organization approached her, a kind woman with a gentle voice. She asked Marie where she was going. Marie did not know how to answer. She had no family in New York. She had no way to contact anyone in France. She was alone. The woman took her to a shelter. They were given food, clothes, a place to sleep. Other survivors were there, women and children mostly, all of them haunted, all of them lost. Marie stayed for 3 weeks. She barely spoke. She moved through the days like a ghost. Claire clung to her constantly, afraid that if she let go, her mother would disappear too. Finally, a French consul helped arrange passage back to France. Marie and Claire boarded another ship. The journey was a nightmare. Every creak of the hull made Marie flinch. Every swell of the waves made her grip Claire's hand tighter. She did not sleep. She barely ate. By the time they reached France, she had lost nearly 20 pounds. Her father met them at the port. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply held his daughter while she wept.
Marie returned to her childhood home, her father's bookshop, the small apartment above it. She moved back into her old room. Claire slept beside her every night, refusing to be alone. Marie tried to rebuild her life. She tried to find work, but people whispered. They whispered about the black man she had married. They whispered about the son who had died. They whispered about the scandal, the disgrace, the tragedy. Some were sympathetic. Most were not. Marie stopped leaving the house. She spent her days in her room, staring at the wall. Her father brought her meals. Her mother tried to talk to her, but Marie had nothing to say. She had locked the memory of the Titanic away in some deep, dark place inside her mind. She refused to speak about it. She refused to think about it. When reporters came asking for interviews, she turned them away. When researchers asked for her account, she refused. The Titanic became a story told by others, by survivors who had been in first class, who had interesting anecdotes, who had lost famous husbands or fathers. But Marie's story was not interesting. It was not the kind of story people wanted to hear. A black man and a white woman, a mixed child who died, another child who survived. It was uncomfortable. It was complicated. It was easier to ignore. And so it was ignored. Samuel's name did not appear in the official list of passengers, not in the first lists published by the newspapers, not in the later, more comprehensive records compiled by historians. He was erased. Not intentionally, perhaps, but erased nonetheless. His ticket had been purchased under a slightly different name, a clerical error. His presence aboard the ship had been noted by few. His death had been witnessed by none. He had simply vanished, as if he had never existed. Marie lived for another 60 years. She never remarried. She never spoke about Samuel. She never spoke about the Titanic. Claire grew up. She married. She had children of her own. But she remembered very little of the voyage, just fragments. Her father's face, the cold, the darkness, the sound of her mother crying. Marie's father died in 1935. Her mother followed a few years later. The bookshop was sold. Marie moved to a smaller apartment. She lived alone. She took in sewing to support herself. She attended church every Sunday. She spoke to almost no one. In 1960, Claire died of cancer. She was 51 years old. Marie buried her daughter and felt nothing. The emptiness inside her had consumed everything. She was a shell, a shadow, a woman who had survived, but only in the most technical sense. And then, in 1995, something changed. A researcher contacted her, a woman who was compiling a comprehensive list of all passengers aboard the Titanic. She had found a record, a ticket purchased in Paris, a family of 4, second class. The names were slightly misspelled, but the details matched. The researcher asked if Marie was the same woman. Marie, who was now 96 years old, who had spent 83 years in silence, who had locked her memories away so deeply that she had almost convinced herself they were not real, said yes. The researcher asked if she would be willing to share her story. Marie hesitated. She thought about Samuel. She thought about Henri. She thought about all the years she had spent pretending they had never existed, because acknowledging them was too painful. And then she said yes. She agreed to an interview. She sat in her small apartment, her hands folded in her lap, and she told the story. She told it slowly, haltingly. Her voice was thin and fragile, but she told it. She spoke about Samuel, about his intelligence, his kindness, his quiet determination. She spoke about the discrimination he had faced, the doors that had been closed to him, the world that had refused to see him as anything more than his skin. She spoke about the voyage, the iceberg, the lifeboats, the last time she had seen her husband, standing at the railing, watching her disappear into the darkness. And she spoke about the silence, the 83 years of silence, the way his name had been erased, the way no one had cared, the way history had forgotten him. The interview was published. It appeared in a small academic journal. Most people did not read it. Most people did not care. But a few did. Researchers began digging. They found the ticket record. They found passenger manifests. They found a few mentions of a black man aboard the Titanic, scattered through survivor testimonies, brief and vague. They confirmed that Samuel had been aboard. They confirmed that he had died. And slowly, carefully, they began to piece together his story. Samuel's name was added to the official list of victims. His photograph, a single image that had survived in Marie's possession, was included in exhibitions. Articles were written. Documentaries mentioned him, not prominently, not as a central figure, but he was there. He was no longer invisible. Marie died in 1997. She was 98 years old. She had lived long enough to see Samuel remembered, long enough to see his name restored. It was a small victory, a quiet one, but it was something. After her death, researchers continued their work. They found more records, more evidence. They learned that Samuel had been an engineer, that he had graduated from a French technical school, that he had been refused work because of his race. They learned about Marie, about their marriage, about the children, about the decision to return to the Caribbean. They learned about the ticket exchange, about the iceberg, about the lifeboats, about the last moments. And they learned about the silence, the 83 years during which Samuel's story had been buried, not because it was unimportant, but because it was inconvenient, because it complicated the narrative, because it forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about race, about class, about whose lives mattered and whose did not. Samuel's story became a footnote, a small detail in the vast, tragic history of the Titanic. But it was there, and that, perhaps, was all that could be hoped for. But there are questions that remain unanswered, questions that will never be answered. Did Samuel know in those final moments that his family would survive? Did he believe Marie when he told her they would see each other again? Or did he know, as he stood at the railing watching the lifeboats disappear, that he was lying? What did he think about as the ship sank? Did he think about his mother, his childhood, The island he would never see again? Did he think about the years he had wasted in France, the opportunities stolen from him, the injustice of a world that had judged him for the color of his skin? Or did he think only of Marie and Claire and Henri, and the future they would have without him? Did he die angry? Did he die afraid? Or did he die with some measure of peace, knowing that at least his family had a chance? We do not know. We cannot know. Samuel left no letters, no diary, no final words. He disappeared into the water, and his thoughts disappeared with him. All we have are the fragments, the ticket, the testimony, the photograph, the silence. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the silence is not just an absence. Perhaps it is a presence, a weight, a reminder of all the voices that have been lost, not just in the sinking of the Titanic, but in the sinking of history itself. How many stories have been erased? How many names have been forgotten? How many lives have been deemed unworthy of memory? Samuel's story was resurrected after 83 years, but how many others remain buried? How many will never be found? The Titanic has become a symbol of hubris, of tragedy, of the fragility of human ambition. But it is also a symbol of inequality. The first-class passengers had a survival rate of over 60%. The third-class passengers had a survival rate of less than 25%. The wealthy survived. The poor died. This was not an accident. This was a system. The gates that separated third class from the upper decks were locked. The lifeboats were filled first with first-class passengers. The rules of the sea, women and children first, applied only within class boundaries. A first-class man had a better chance of survival than a third-class child. And Samuel, a second-class passenger, a black man, had no chance at all. The world remembers the Titanic as a tragedy, but it forgets that it was also an atrocity, a failure not just of engineering, but of humanity. The ship sank because it struck an iceberg, but people died because of decisions. Decisions about who mattered. Decisions about who deserved to live. Decisions that were made long before the ship ever left port. And those decisions were not made by the iceberg. They were made by people. By a society that valued some lives over others. By a system that treated human beings as cargo, sorted and classified, and assigned worth based on wealth and race and class. Samuel was a victim of that system. He died not just because the Titanic sank. He died because the world he lived in had already decided he did not matter. And for 83 years, that decision was upheld. His name was erased. His story was forgotten. His existence was denied. Until an old woman, in the final years of her life, decided to speak. And in speaking, she resurrected him. There is a photograph of Samuel, only one. It was taken in Paris, sometime around 1910. He is standing in front of a building, his hands at his sides, his expression serious. He is wearing a suit, dark and well-fitted. His posture is straight, his gaze is direct. He looks like a man who refuses to apologize for his existence. Marie kept that photograph for 83 years. She kept it hidden. She did not display it. She did not show it to anyone. But she kept it. And when the researcher came, when Marie finally agreed to tell her story, she gave them the photograph. It is the only image of Samuel that survives, the only proof that he was real, that he existed, that he lived and loved and died. Look at that photograph. Look at his face. Try to imagine what he was thinking. Try to imagine the weight he carried, The knowledge that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, the world would never see him as equal. Try to imagine the love he felt for his family, the desperation that drove him to board the Titanic, the hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be different on the other side of the ocean. And then imagine him standing at the railing, watching his family disappear into the darkness, knowing he would never see them again, knowing that the world would forget he ever existed. And ask yourself, how many others are there? How many photographs are hidden away? How many stories remain untold? How many names have been lost? The Titanic rests on the ocean floor, 2.5 miles below the surface. The wreck is slowly disintegrating. Rust and bacteria are consuming the metal. In a few decades, there will be nothing left but a pile of sediment. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable is being erased by time. But the stories survive. Some of them. The ones that were recorded, the ones that were deemed important, the ones that fit the narrative. The rest are gone, lost to silence, lost to indifference, lost to the same forces that erased Samuel. But here is what we know. We know that Samuel existed. We know that he boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912. We know that he traveled with his wife and 2 children. We know that he was a trained engineer. We know that he faced discrimination. We know that he tried to build a better life. We know that he died in the sinking. We know that his name was forgotten. We know that his wife spent 83 years in silence. And we know that, in the end, she spoke. That is not much, but it is something. It is a refusal to let the silence be complete, a refusal to let Samuel be erased entirely. And perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, that someone, somewhere, will remember, that someone will refuse to let our names be forgotten, that someone will speak, even if it takes 83 years. So here is Samuel's story, incomplete, fragmented, built from scraps and silence. But here, the only black man known to have traveled aboard the Titanic, a man whose existence was denied for 83 years, a man who loved his family, a man who dreamed of a better future, a man who died alone in the freezing water of the North Atlantic, a man whose name was erased, and then, against all odds, resurrected. Remember him, not because his story is unique, but because it is not. There are thousands like him, millions, people whose lives were lived and lost in the margins, people whose names were never recorded, people whose stories were never told. Samuel's story survived because one woman refused to stay silent. But how many others are still lost? How many will never be found? This is not a story about the Titanic. Not really. It is a story about erasure, about whose lives are remembered and whose are forgotten, about the violence of silence, about the power of speaking, and about the truth that, no matter how deeply you bury a story, someone, someday, might dig it up. 83 years is a long time, but it is not forever. Samuel's story endured, and it will continue to endure. Not in museums, not in grand narratives, but here, in the quiet spaces, in the margins, in the places where history hides its uncomfortable truths. This is the story the world tried to forget. This is the story that survived anyway. This is Samuel.